All right, so today we're going deep on a thinker who, might not be a household name, but he really shook things up in philosophy back in the 20th century.
Yeah, Cary Williams, definitely someone worth getting to know, I think, especially if you, are interested in like the really big questions about, what's real, what we can know, how we should live, that sort of thing.
You know what I think is so interesting about him is that he was writing during this time when philosophy was kind of going through a bit of an identity crisis,
Yeah, you had like the logical positivists saying, look, if you can't verify it empirically, it's meaningless. And then Wittgenstein over there talking about language games. And then, of course, existentialism was all the rage.
And Williams is like, hold on a minute, folks. We can't just abandon the whole project of trying to understand reality itself.
Exactly. He's like, we've been wrestling with these big metaphysical questions for centuries, and they're not going away just because we're feeling a bit uncertain.
So for our listeners who are, up for a good philosophical workout today, we're diving into some of Williams' most powerful and frankly, mind-bending ideas.
We're talking about his commitment to naturalism. The idea that the natural world is all there is his really unique trope theory of properties and his attempt to put inductive reasoning on a solid foundation.
So strap in, everybody, because this is going to be a fun one.
So I think to really appreciate Williams, you have to understand the context, the philosophical landscape he was working in.
Right. Like mid-20th century philosophy was a pretty wild scene.
Totally. I mean, there was this real sense that the traditional aims of philosophy, trying to figure out the nature of reality and all that, maybe that was just too ambitious.
Too grand,
Yeah, like maybe we needed to scale back our expectations and focus on something more manageable, like analyzing language or the logic of science.
But Williams was having none of it. He was like, nope, philosophy is about the big picture. We can't just give up on that.
And he called out his contemporaries on this too. He saw all these other trends, logical behaviorism, existentialism, even Zen Buddhism as examples of what he called philosophical relaxation.
Like everyone was just getting too comfy.
Yeah, basically. And he thought this was a dangerous trend because for him, philosophy had to be about something more than just our subjective experiences or linguistic conventions. It had to be grounded in reality itself.
And that commitment to reality, to trying to figure out what's actually out there, is really at the heart of his philosophy.
Absolutely. He was a staunch realist and an empiricist. He famously said that practically everything was right out there where it belonged.
So for him, the world exists independently of our minds. It's not just a projection of our thoughts or feelings.
Exactly. But at the same time, he was also an empiricist, meaning he believed that all our knowledge ultimately comes from experience from our senses.
And this might seem like a bit of a contradiction, right? Like, how can you be both a realist, believing in a mind-independent world, and an empiricist, believing that knowledge comes from our senses?
Well, Williams argued that while our knowledge starts with experience, it can go beyond it through legitimate inference. We can reason from what we observe to what we haven't yet observed.
So it's not just about what we can directly see or touch.
Mm-hmm.
It's also about what we can logically infer from those experiences.
Exactly. And this is crucial for science, for example. We can't directly observe electrons, but we can infer their existence from the effects they have on things we can observe.
And here's where I think it gets really interesting. Williams even applied this empirical mindset to philosophy itself.
Oh, yeah, he did. He questioned the idea that philosophy is purely a priori, based on reason alone, independent of experience.
Right, like some philosophers thought we could just sit in our armchairs and think our way to the truth about the universe.
Yeah, well, he was like, come on, guys, that's not how it works. He pointed out that a lot of philosophical thought is actually provisional based on the best evidence we have at the time. But that evidence can change, and so can our philosophical conclusions.
So philosophy isn't about finding some eternal, unchanging truths. It's about constantly revising and refining our understanding of the world based on new information and new arguments.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process, a conversation that's always ongoing.
And that's something I really appreciate about Williams, his willingness to be open to new ideas, to change his mind when the evidence demands it.
All right, well, let's dive into some of the specifics of his philosophy then. Shall we start with his metaphysics?
Sounds good. I'm ready to get meta.
So Williams was really helpful here. He actually divided metaphysics into two main branches, speculative cosmology and analytic ontology.
Okay, break that down for me. What's the difference?
So speculative cosmology is basically trying to figure out the fundamental stuff of the universe, the basic building blocks of reality, what's it all made of.
The big picture stuff.
Exactly. And analytic ontology, on the other hand, is more about analyzing the basic categories of being, things like substance and property and relation.
Okay, so cosmology is about what exists, and ontology is about how we categorize and understand what exists.
You got it. And Williams emphasized that cosmology especially has to be informed by empirical science. What we learn about the universe through observation and experimentation.
Because our understanding of the universe is always evolving, right? So our cosmology has to evolve with it.
Right on. And when it comes to his own cosmology, Williams was a pretty hardcore naturalist. He believed that the natural world of space-time and matter is all there is.
No supernatural beings, no other realms of existence, just the physical universe we can observe.
Exactly. And this wasn't just some kind of vague preference for him. He had good reasons for believing this.
Like what kind of reasons?
Well, he thought that appeals to supernatural entities or other realms were often just ways to explain things we didn't yet understand scientifically.
Like the God of the Gaps argument.
Exactly. But he thought that as science progressed, we'd find natural explanations for more and more phenomena, and the need for supernatural explanations would diminish.
So he was basically betting on the power of science to explain the world.
He was. And he thought that this naturalistic worldview was the most parsimonious one, the one that made the fewest unnecessary assumptions.
Like Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is usually the best.
Right. And his naturalism was also materialistic, though not in the crude reductionist sense that some people might think of.
Right. It's not like he thought everything could be reduced to just little billiard balls bouncing around.
No, he recognized that there are different levels of complexity in the universe, and he called his view spatiotemporal naturalism.
Spatiotemporal naturalism.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What does that mean?
Basically, it means that anything that exists within the fabric of space and time. So properties like colors, shapes, relations, even abstract concepts, they're all part of the natural world as long as they can be located in space-time.
So it's not just about matter. It's about anything that has a place in space and time.
That's it. And this makes his materialism really flexible because it can accommodate new discoveries in science. Whatever physics tells us about the fundamental constituents of the universe, Williams's materialism can handle it.
So even consciousness for him was part of the natural world.
Absolutely. He didn't deny the reality of consciousness, but he saw it as being dependent on the physical structure of the brain.
So no mind-body dualism for Williams.
Nope. For him, it was all one interconnected system.
And this brings us to one of the most fascinating and mind-bending aspects of his philosophy, his four-dimensional view of space-time.
Oh, yeah. This is where things get really trippy.
So Williams was heavily influenced by Einstein's theory of relativity, and especially Minkowski's interpretation of it, which treats time as a fourth dimension.
And this led him to some pretty radical conclusions about the nature of time.
Like what, for instance?
Well, he argued that all points in time, past, present, and future, are equally real.
Wait a minute. So you're saying the future already exists?
In a sense, yes. For Williams, the future is just as fixed and determined as the past.
But that doesn't feel right, does it? I mean, we experience time as flowing, as moving from past to present to future.
I know it's counterintuitive, but that's what Williams believed. And he actually wrote a famous paper called The Myth of Passage, where he argued that the feeling of time passing is an illusion.
An illusion. Wow. So how do we explain that feeling then, if time isn't actually flowing?
Well, Williams thought it was a product of our consciousness. Our minds are constantly moving from one moment of experience to the next, and that creates the sensation of time passing.
So it's like a trick our minds are playing on us.
Yeah, kind of like how a movie creates the illusion of motion by showing us a rapid sequence of still images.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together, but it definitely takes some getting used to.
It does. It's a pretty radical departure from our common sense view of time.
All right, well, now that we've sort of wrapped our heads around Williams's four-dimensional space-time, let's move on to what is arguably his most original contribution to philosophy, his trope theory.
Ah, yes, trope theory. This is where things get really metaphysically interesting.
So tell me, what's a trope?
Okay, so in traditional metaphysics, properties are understood as universals. Like redness is a universal property that can be instantiated by many different things: a fire truck, a stop sign, an apple.
Right, so the universal is like a blueprint, and the individual things are like copies of that blueprint.
Yeah, something like that. But Williams thought this whole view of universals was problematic. He thought it was more parsimonious to think of properties as particulars, as individual instances tied to specific things.
So instead of there being one universal redness, there are many particular rednesses, one for each red thing.
Exactly. And he called these particular properties tropes.
Okay, so a trope is like a unique instance of a property.
That's it. So the redness of this particular apple is a trope. It's not the same redness as the redness of that fryer truck over there. Each one is unique and unrepeatable.
That's an interesting way to think about it. So what are the implications of this view?
Well, for one thing, it gets rid of the need for a separate realm of abstract universals.
Because now the properties are right there in the world, located in space and time.
Exactly. And Williams took this idea even further. He believed that reality is made up of nothing but tropes.
Whoa, hold on. So you're saying that everything that exists is just a collection of tropes?
That's the idea. He famously described tropes as the alphabet of being.
The alphabet of being.
Yeah.
Interesting. So how does that work?
Well, he thought that all the things we normally think of as objects are actually just clusters of tropes.
So this table, for example, is just a bunch of tropes clustered together.
Exactly. It's got a shape trope, a color trope, a texture trope, and so on. And all these tropes are located together in space and time.
Okay, but what's holding those tropes together? Why don't they just float apart?
Well, that's the radical part. Williams didn't think there was anything holding them together. No underlying substance, no bare particular that has the tropes.
So it's not like there's a table thing that has the property of being brown and square.
Nope. The tropes are all there is. It's tropes all the way down.
Okay, so this is a no-substance view of reality.
You got it. And it's a pretty radical departure from traditional metaphysics.
It definitely is. So how does Williams account for universal properties then? If there's no universal redness, how do we explain the fact that multiple things can be red?
Well, he said that universals are actually just resemblance classes.
Resemblance classes. So what does that mean?
It means that a universal like redness is just the set of all particular redness tropes that resemble each other.
So it's not one thing. It's a collection of similar things.
Exactly. And this applies to relations too. Like taller than is just the set of all particular taller than tropes.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So trope theory is a way of explaining the world in terms of particular properties rather than abstract universals.
That's a great way to put it. And it's a really elegant and parsimonious theory. It manages to explain a lot with very little.
But of course, it's not without its challenges, right? I mean, it goes against a lot of our intuitions about how the world works.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's a very controversial theory. And there are a lot of objections to it.
Like what kind of objections?
Well, one common objection is that properties can't really be independent of objects. You know, like you were saying earlier, what's holding the tropes together? Why don't they just float apart?
Right. It seems like a trope has to be the trope of something.
Yeah, and some critics argue that this means there has to be some kind of underlying substance or bare particular that the tropes are attached to.
So trope theory isn't really getting rid of substance, it's just pushing it back a level.
That's the argument. But trope theorists have responses to this.
Like what?
Well, some of them just bite the bullet and say, yeah, objects are just bundles of tropes. There's no need for anything else.
So the object is just the collection of its tropes.
Exactly. And others argue that there are primitive relations of compresence or dependence that tie the tropes together in a meaningful way.
Okay, so maybe there's a special kind of relation that only holds between tropes that are part of the same object.
Right. Something like that. Another objection is that tropes might not be as simple as Williams thought.
What do you mean?
Well, some philosophers argue that each trope has to have both a nature and a particularity.
So the nature is what kind of property it is, like redness. And the particularity is what makes it this particular instance of redness.
Right. And if tropes have this kind of internal structure, then maybe they're not really the most fundamental building blocks of reality.
Maybe there's something even more basic than tropes.
That's what some critics argue.
And then there's the problem of resemblance classes.
This is a tricky one.
So Williams says that universals are just sets of resembling tropes. But how do we determine which tropes resemble each other?
Right. It seems like we need some kind of standard of resemblance, and that standard would itself have to be a universal.
So we're back to square one.
Yeah.
We're still stuck with universals.
That's the worry. And some philosophers think this is a fatal flaw in trope theory.
And then there are all the classic objections to bundle theories in general.
Right, like the problem of accidental properties. How can a bundle of tropes account for the fact that objects can change over time?
If an object is just its tropes, and those tropes are all essential to it, then how can it gain or lose properties?
That's a tough one. And then there's the Bradley regress, which is a really thorny problem for any theory that tries to explain relations in terms of further relations.
So if an object is just a bundle of tropes, what's holding those tropes together in a bundle?
Right. If it's another trope, then what's holding that trope together with the others? It seems like we're just going to keep needing more and more tropes.
It's tropes all the way down.
Exactly. And then there's the no swapping objection, which is a really intuitive one.
What's that one?
Well, it basically says that if tropes are just particulars, then it should be possible to swap two identical tropes between two different objects without changing anything.
So, like, I could take the redness trope from this apple and swap it with the redness trope from that fire truck,
Yeah.
and everything would be exactly the same.
Right. But that seems wrong. It seems like there's something more to an object than just its collection of tropes.
Like, there's something about the object itself that makes it unique, and that can't be captured by just its properties.
Exactly.
So yeah, trope theory definitely faces some serious challenges.
It does. But it's also a really powerful and thought-provoking theory, and it's still being actively debated and developed by philosophers today.
Well, I'm glad we had a chance to dive into it. It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Okay, so are you ready to tackle another big Williams idea?
Hit me with it.
All right, so let's talk about induction.
Induction. Oh,
Yeah.
boy.
Yeah.
Now, that's a topic that can really make a philosopher's head spin.
Yeah, it's one of the most fundamental problems in epistemology. How do we justify our beliefs about the unobserved based on our observations of the observed?
Right. Like, how do we know that the sun will rise tomorrow just because it's risen every day in the past?
Exactly. And this isn't just some abstract philosophical puzzle. It has real-world implications.
Yeah, if we can't trust induction, then we can't trust science or really any kind of reasoning about the future.
And Williams himself was really concerned about the implications of inductive skepticism. He thought it could lead to a kind of intellectual paralysis and inability to make rational decisions about the world.
Because if we can't trust our past experiences to guide our future actions, then what can we trust?
Right. And, Hume's classic problem of induction really threw a wrench into things.
Oh, yeah. Hume's argument is a tough one to crack.
Basically, he argued that there's no logical justification for believing that the future will resemble the past.
Just because something has happened a certain way in the past doesn't mean it will continue to happen that way in the future.
And he's right, there's no logical guarantee.
Oh.
But Williams was one of the few philosophers who thought that Hume's skepticism could be overcome.
So he thought there was a way to justify induction.
He did, and he had a really interesting approach to it. He drew on probability theory and especially Bernoulli's theorem.
Okay, I'm not a mathematician, so you're going to have to explain that one to me.
Sure, so Bernoulli's theorem is basically about the relationship between populations and samples. Like if you have a bag of marbles and you want to know what proportion of them are red, you can take a sample of marbles and count how many are red.
Right. And the larger your sample, the more likely it is to accurately reflect the proportion of red marbles in the whole bag.
Exactly. And that's what Bernoulli's theorem tells us. It gives us a way to calculate the probability that our sample is representative of the population.
Okay, so how does this relate to induction?
Well, Williams's insight was that our observations of the world can be seen as samples from larger populations.
So like all the ravens we've ever seen are a sample of the population of all ravens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if our sample is large enough and random enough, then Bernoulli's theorem tells us that it's highly probable that it will resemble the population as a whole.
So if all the ravens we've seen have been black, then it's highly probable that most ravens are black.
Right. And this is how Williams justified induction. He argued that it's a kind of statistical inference. We're inferring from the properties of our sample to the properties of the population.
And because Bernoulli's theorem gives us a way to calculate the probability of our sample being representative, we can be reasonably confident in our inductive inferences.
That's the idea. It's not a deductive guarantee, but it's a probabilistic justification.
So we can't be absolutely certain that the sun will rise tomorrow, but we can be highly confident based on our past observations.
Exactly. And that's good enough for Williams. He thought that a high degree of probability was sufficient for rational belief.
So he was okay with a little bit of uncertainty.
He was, as long as the probabilities were in our favor.
Okay, so that's Williams' defense of induction in a nutshell. But of course, it wasn't without its critics.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There were plenty of philosophers who weren't convinced.
Like, what were some of their objections?
Well, one common objection was that Williams's argument seemed to rely on the assumption that our samples are random.
But in the real world, our observations aren't always random, right? We might be more likely to observe certain things than others.
That's true. And if our samples are biased, then Bernoulli's theorem might not apply.
So Williams's justification of induction might only work in ideal circumstances.
That's a worry. And then there was the problem of GRU.
GRU? What's GRU?
It's a made-up predicate that Nelson Goodman came up with to challenge the idea that inductive inferences can be purely formal.
Okay, I'm listening.
So imagine we define GRU as green before the year 2100 and blue after the year 2100.
Right, I'm following so far.
So now let's say we've observed a bunch of emeralds and they've all been green.
Right.
Well, according to Williams's argument, we should be able to inductively infer that all emeralds are GRU.
Because all the emeralds we've seen so far have been green, and green is a subset of GRU.
Exactly. But that seems wrong because it would mean that all the emeralds after the year 2100 will suddenly turn blue.
Yeah, that doesn't sound right.
And that's Goodman's point. He's showing that Williams's argument can lead to absurd conclusions if we allow for these kinds of weird predicates.
So maybe there's something more to induction than just statistical inference.
Maybe. And then there are objections about the role of background knowledge in inductive reasoning.
Right. It's not just about the evidence we've observed, it's also about what we already believe about the world.
Exactly. And some critics argued that Williams's account didn't take this background knowledge sufficiently into account.
So even if our observations suggest that something is true, we might still have good reason to doubt it if it conflicts with our prior beliefs.
Well, that's a valid point.
Mm.
But despite all these objections, Williams's defense of induction was a really ambitious and important project.
It was a serious attempt to solve a really fundamental problem.
Yeah.
And it's being discussed and debated by philosophers today.
Well, I think it's fair to say that Donald Cary Williams was a truly original thinker.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to go against the grain to challenge the prevailing philosophical trends of his time.
And he came up with some really radical and thought-provoking ideas.
We covered a lot of ground today. We talked about his naturalism, his four-dimensional view of space-time, his trope theory, and his defense of induction.
And all these ideas are interconnected. They all stem from his deep commitment to philosophical realism, to the idea that there's a mind-independent world out there that we can come to know through observation and reason.
And I think what's so inspiring about Williams is that he never gave up on that project of trying to understand reality, even when it got really complex and challenging.
Yeah, he was a true philosophical pioneer, and I think his work still has a lot to offer us today.
So for our listeners who are intrigued by Williams's ideas and want to learn more, I encourage you to check out his writings.
You won't be disappointed. He's a really engaging writer, and his ideas are sure to challenge and stimulate your thinking.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the philosophy of Donald Cary Williams.
Thanks for joining us on this philosophical adventure.
And until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep exploring the big ideas that shape our understanding of the world.
And maybe go back and think about Williams's four-dimensional view of time. Does that change how you think about your future plans at all?
That's a good one to ponder. Thanks, everybody.
See ya.